I think most Americans have this view of Lincoln as the great emancipator, this, heroic figure who saved the Union and freed the slaves. And I think the reason for that is that there is this narrative that has trickled down over the years, over many, many years. And it started really with the folklore that cropped up in the years following Lincoln's assassination. Because of course, the Civil War was a divisive time, and opinions about Lincoln were mixed in those years. In the late 1860s, the 1870s, folklore sort of rose up in the ashes of his assassination. And then, the public education system became more centralized. You have a stronger federal government. And then on a state-by-state basis, the late 1800s is when we start to get some of these compulsory education laws passed. And so they start putting these ideas about Lincoln as a hero in the textbooks. And then, of course, once you get into the 20th century, you get pop culture. You get films about Lincoln, you get books about Lincoln, songs that mention Lincoln, television, you name it. You get 100 years now of pop culture just driving this image of Lincoln into our heads. So it's very hard for people to break from that, and understandably so, because to view Lincoln as a tyrant or as a monster implies that the Civil War was lost, and that, in fact, you live in the country that lost, not the country that won. And that's not a comfortable thing for people to feel. So I think people avoid that idea at all costs, and they embrace this view of Lincoln. They had to work really hard to rehabilitate his image, and I think that I can sort of prove that. So the first question I think we want to ask, if we're going to go down this path, is why would the South want to secede? And in order to answer that question, I think it helps to think of the Civil War in the context of the decades that preceded it, and to think about the people who lived during the Civil War as grandchildren of the American Revolution, because they were. A lot of these people had grandparents who had fought in the Revolutionary War against the King of England, and that idea was fresh in their minds. They were very sensitive. I mean, this is part of the reason why the Articles of Confederation were written the way that they were, and why the U.S. Constitution was written the way that it was, is because these people were very sensitive to power. So they viewed the Civil War as the Second American Revolution. That's what it was from their perspective. Now, you're going to get sort of two objections from people, I think, when you say something like this to the average person. And the first is always going to be, okay, but what about slavery? And I think that's an important caveat. Like, if we're being honest, we do have to admit that the South was involved in this horrific, evil chattel slavery. It's important to remember that the northern states, a lot of them had already abolished slavery through democratic means. So if democracy works, then why not allow the South to engage in it as well? It's kind of hard to claim that you live in a democracy when you use violence when people won't vote the way that you want. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that even if you could make the case that, yeah, but these people are oppressed and we need to do something about it, Lincoln used conscription to do that. So he forced people to go to war with their fellow countrymen. So again, not exactly a democratic way of going about things. And the Civil War very quickly became unpopular. The second thing that people like to point out is that the attack on Fort Sumter was the start of the Civil War, and that was the Confederacy's fault. But you have to leave out a lot of the violence that led up to the attack on Fort Sumter in order to have that convenient excuse, right? You have to ignore the fact that Union forces were already in the South. There was a lot of violence that led up to Fort Sumter. You know, the Fort Sumter thing sort of just serves as an excuse, as a convenient way to claim that the North was acting in defense of itself and in defense of the slaves. So I think that those are the two big objections you're going to get from people. They both kind of fall apart. You start to get a picture of Lincoln as America's first dictator. And like, really the question that you have to ask yourself with all of this is like, was the Civil War worth it? Was 800,000 dead Americans worth it? Not to mention the fact that the Union, when they took prisoners of war, they also took slaves. And they put these people in labor camps. They put slaves, they took freed slaves and put them in labor camps. I mean, it's really hard to make the case, I think, that all of the violence that took place, the hundreds of thousands dead, the people put in labor camps, and then after the war ended, all of the violence that took place after that. Because here's the thing, if you want to, people who are fighting for their independence tend to stop fighting when they become free. If you look at the American Revolution, there was some, but there was not a lot of violence following the end of the Revolutionary War. The Civil War was totally different. The Civil War had tons of violence, tons of resentment and hostility following the end of the war. And I think that helps to clarify what you're looking at when you consider the Civil War. The Union was after conquest. The Confederacy was after independence. Most people have probably heard that Lincoln jailed, he suspended habeas corpus, and he did that unilaterally without Congress's approval, which was illegal at the time. Of course, it was later ratified by Congress, but when he did it, he was violating the Constitution. And you know, it's not just that stuff. You know, it's not just the violence and stuff. It's like he suspended habeas corpus. He put people in prison, with some without trial, some without charges. And one of those people is this guy, George Proctor Kane. George Proctor Kane, as I mentioned earlier, was the police marshal in Baltimore. And he's an interesting figure because he had Southern sympathies, but he was also dedicated to his duty as the Marshal of Police. And so in February of 1861, after Lincoln is elected and this tension is rising in the country, he's asked by Lincoln to get Lincoln through Baltimore safely so that he can make his way to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. And George Proctor Kane agrees to do this. He sets up an escort for Lincoln and Mary Todd. And then Lincoln sends this guy, Alan Pinkerton, who is essentially his intelligence guy. He sends him ahead to investigate George Proctor Kane, and Pinkerton comes to the conclusion that George Proctor Kane is too much of a risk, and that he might even be involved in a plot to assassinate Lincoln. So Lincoln secretly travels through Baltimore 9 hours earlier than planned in the middle of the night without telling George Proctor Kane, skips out on dinner and just totally ghosts this guy. So that's the first thing that happens with George Proctor Kane. A couple of months later, Lincoln's in Washington, D.C., and he needs more troops. And so there are Union troops traveling to D.C., and they also have to travel. See, Baltimore's an interesting area because it's like the closest city north of Washington, D.C. So even though it was a border, you know, it's in a border state, Maryland, Lincoln and these troops and everybody had to travel through it in order to get to the nation's capital. So in April of 1861, these troops are traveling through Baltimore, and the residents of Baltimore go totally nuts. They're not having it. And there was an event that is now known as the Pratt Street Riots that happened. And George Proctor Kane's role in this was to quell the riots, was to get involved and to protect Union forces as they traveled through, and to try to get the residents of Baltimore to calm down. And of course, you know, as the Marshal of Police, he had limited resources, but he did his best to do this. And yet, in June of 1861, what does Lincoln do? He has Kane arrested. He does not afford him habeas corpus. He's charged with treason, never tried, and he is put in prison for almost a year and a half. And he gets very sick. You know, the conditions are horrible. And then he's finally released after about a year and a half. He has to go to Canada, and then he has to travel to the South, to Virginia, in order to be safe until the war is over. And this is just one example of, I mean, Lincoln arrested, I think I read 15,000 civilians, and he arrested the mayor of Baltimore, a bunch of legislators, of course, the Marshal of Police. You know, this is just one example of one of the many things that Lincoln did as president early on that really, I think, solidifies this picture of Lincoln as the great tyrant. So I wrote a song a few years ago about this George Proctor Kane fella and sort of his view of Lincoln. You've been gone so long, forgot about the whole thing, took no time at all, we got you wrong, so long, you were so wrong to break your vow. Dear Mr. Winter, would have bought you dinner if it wasn't for the soldiers' dynamite on the tracks. Will you be back? We'll become friends. We'll make amends. In the end, tobacco farmers bring in a lot of cash. Yeah, been gone so long, forgot about the whole thing, took no time at all. Months later, you